The American Story, The Beginnings, by David Barton and Tim Barton, as read by Karl Hirsch. The American Story highlights some of the interesting moments and people that reveal God's providence in America. We have a fascinating history that must be remembered and passed on to future generations. Section 3, The American War for Independence. Chapter 16, Continental Congress, 1776, as well as chapters 17 and 18, God's Providence Through the War. The Battle of Long Island, August 76, the crossing of the Delaware in the Battle of Trenton, December of 76. Shortly after the Continental Congress declared independence from Great Britain, it appointed Reverend Jacob Duché, an Anglican, as its chaplain. He served several months, then resigned to focus on his church responsibilities. Congress appointed two chaplains to replace him, the Reverend Patrick Allison, a Baptist, and the Reverend William White, an Episcopalian. When the Reverend Allison declined, Congress chose the Reverend George Duffield, a Presbyterian. Under the U.S. Constitution, the first federal Congress retained two congressional chaplains. That practice continues to this present day, with one chaplain for the House and one for the Senate. When the Continental Congress made George Washington commanding general over the Continental Army, one of his first military orders informed the troops, "The general hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country." Just as Congress had issued official calls to prayer when tensions with Great Britain began escalating, it continued that policy throughout the conflict. This practice had been central to American public life from our earliest days. During times of crisis, civil authorities would proclaim days of fasting and prayer to seek God's help. Then, when God answered those prayers, civic leaders would proclaim days of prayer and thanksgiving to express their gratitude to Him. There are many examples illustrating this alternating pattern. For instance, in October of 1746, France sent a fleet to attack Boston. Governor Shirley proclaimed a day of fasting to seek God's intervention, and people everywhere thronged to the churches to pray. When God miraculously answered their prayers and a sudden storm wiped out the French fleet, they gathered in a time of thanksgiving to God. During the American War for Independence, the Continental Congress followed the same sequence. It issued at least 8 different prayer and fasting proclamations during the conflict, with 7 intervening Thanksgiving proclamations. The proclamations acknowledged specific issues and also addressed spiritual matters. These calls to prayer were not bland, vague, or deistic. They were explicitly Christian. For example, in March 1776, the founders asked the country to observe a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, that we may appease His righteous displeasure, and through the merits and mediation of Jesus Christ, obtain His pardon and forgiveness. Subsequent national calls to prayer were just as forthright, calling on the nation to join the penitent confession of their manifold sins, that it may please God, through the merits of Jesus Christ, mercifully to forgive and blot them out of remembrance, and to prosper the means of religion for the promotion and enlargement of that kingdom, which consisteth in righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Ghost. Romans 14:17. That was done on November 1st, 1777. Another one, to thank God that above all, that He hath diffused the glorious light of the gospel, whereby through the merits of our gracious Redeemer, we may become the heirs of His eternal glory, asking America also to pray, that He would spread the light of Christian knowledge through the remotest corners of the earth. That was done October 20th, 1779. And another one, to offer our fervent supplications to the God of all grace, to cause the knowledge of Christianity to spread over all the earth. That was October 18th, 1790. When a state or the national government issued a prayer proclamation, people would often gather at their local meeting houses and churches to hear a corresponding sermon. The state legislature or the National Congress would often go to church as an official unified body on those days. At such gatherings, legislatures would invite a minister to preach, and many of those sermons were then printed and distributed at the government's expense. This American practice of calling days of fasting or Thanksgiving was so strong that by 1815, civil governments had issued at least 1,400 official prayer proclamations. Thousands more have been issued since that time, a tradition that now spans more than 4 centuries of the American story, and one that continues to the present day. Throughout the war, the Americans witnessed many direct miracles, the Golden Thread, which helped secure the eventual victory. In August of 1776, fighting erupted on the western edge of Long Island, New York. British General Howe and his army of 32,000 men inflicted heavy losses on the 8,000 American troops. At Brooklyn Heights, Howe prepared to destroy the remaining Americans, thus ending the war only a month after independence had been declared. The British Army backed Washington's heavily outnumbered troops up against the East River and created a semicircle around them, fully entrapping them. Washington realized that to stand and fight against such odds would mean defeat and the end of the war, but to surrender was unthinkable. However, despite his superior position and numbers, General Howe delayed his assault for 2 days. Had he struck immediately, victory would have been almost certain, and the quest for independence ended. Washington, with all land routes blocked by the British, decided to retreat across the nearly mile-wide river behind them. He issued orders for every rowboat, sailboat, and sea-going vessel in the area to be quietly collected and used for an escape. But unknown to him, the British were planning to close that route by sailing their ships up the river to block his retreat. As Washington's men gathered the small craft, a strong storm entered the region. Heavy rain fell and fierce winds blew, preventing the British ships from taking up their position. By evening, the Americans had collected a fleet of small boats and began loading and departing on the stormy waters. But the waves were so turbulent that the boats could only be partially loaded. However, at 11 o'clock that evening, when it was too dark for British ships to advance up the river, the raging winds finally calmed. A gentle breeze then began to flow from the south and southwest, which favored the Americans, allowing them to fully load the rest of the boats. Washington's men crossed the river all night without being seen or heard. But as the sun began rising, not all the troops had been evacuated. The British would see what they were doing, and death or capture for the remaining Americans would be inevitable. But something completely strange, unexpected happened. American Major Benjamin Talmadge, still with the remaining men, reported, quote, "As the dawn of the next day approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety, and when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty. At this time, a very dense fog began to rise, and it seemed to settle in a peculiar manner over both encampments. I recollect this peculiar providential occurrence perfectly well, and so very dense was the atmosphere that I could scarcely discern a man at 6 yards distance. The fog hovered over the area until the last American boats left, carrying the remaining troops to safety." If the story ended here, it would definitely be a miraculous account. But there was still more to the story. Yet another extraordinary event had occurred during the retreat. A family of British sympathizers lived near the point where the American troops were being evacuated. The lady of the house, when she learned what the Americans were doing, sent a servant to alert the British. He successfully slipped past the American guards, but upon reaching the British lines was stopped by German-speaking mercenaries known as Hessians, whom the British had hired to fight for them. The servant was unable to communicate with the foreign guards, who detained him until the next morning. When a British officer finally arrived to question him, it was too late. Upon learning from the servant about the American evacuation, British troops were immediately dispatched, only to find the Continental camp completely empty. The British then rushed toward the shore, arriving just as the fog lifted, allowing them to see the last boats crossing the river. More than 8,000 American soldiers and their supplies had miraculously escaped. Providentially, Washington and the Americans had been preserved and kept alive to continue the fight for freedom. The Bible is full of passages describing how God used unusual or unexpected weather to save his people. Examples include when he sent a great darkness and hailstones on Israel's enemy, Exodus 9 and 10. A strong east wind parted the Red Sea, Exodus 14. And a huge, unusually shaped cloud guided them through the wilderness and on to the Promised Land, Exodus 13 through 14. The book of Jonah likewise describes God sending a mighty tempest that caused Jonah to be cast overboard, where he was swallowed by a great fish, thus ensuring that he submit himself to God's plan so that a nation could be saved, Jonah 1 through 4. And when Joshua needed more time to defeat an enemy, God held the sun still in the sky for an extra day, giving him a great victory, Joshua 10. In the New Testament, perhaps the most telling example is when Jesus calmed the violent storm on the sea, causing his disciples to exclaim, quote, "Who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him?" Mark 4:41. Many miraculous events that greatly aided the Americans in the war for independence involved similarly unusual, unforeseen, and sudden providential changes in weather. A few months after the retreat from Long Island, Washington found himself in another desperate situation that again threatened an early end to the war. The American Army consisted of citizen volunteers who enlisted for up to 1 year at a time. It was now December, at the end of the first year of the conflict, so most of the enlistments were up at the end of the month. There had been few American military victories, so both morale and reenlistments were low. Washington's army was rapidly dwindling. Another defeat at the hands of the British would likely destroy all remaining hope. Washington knew he had to make a bold decision and go on the offense. In a desperate move, he decided to cross the icy Delaware River during Christmas night and attack the British and German Hessian garrison at Trenton in the pre-dawn hours of December 26. As the American troops began the treacherous crossing, a violent snow and winter hailstorm suddenly erupted, which made their trek even more difficult. But unrealized by them at the time, this hardship worked in their favor by reducing the visibility to near zero, thus causing the Hessian sentries to leave their posts and seek cover. The Americans therefore entered Trenton with no resistance, completely surprising the enemy. After only 45 minutes of fighting, 20 Hessians were killed, 100 wounded, and 1,000 were captured. On the American side, only 3 were wounded in the battle, although 2 soldiers froze to death on the harsh march. One of the 3 wounded was young officer James Monroe. As they were silently approaching the battle site in the darkness of those early morning hours, Dr. John Riker had been awakened by dogs barking at the Patriot troops passing outside his home. Rushing out in the darkness, he angrily confronted Monroe, asking what they were doing. Upon learning they were Americans, his anger disappeared, and he said, quote, "I know something is to be done, and I'm going with you. I'm a doctor, and I may help some poor fellow." End quote. During the ensuing battle, Monroe was shot in the chest, severing an artery. He later testified, quote, "I would have bled to death if this doctor had not been near." End quote. The impromptu decision by Dr. Riker to accompany the troops providentially saved the life of the, quote, "poor fellow," who became the 5th President of the United States. General Henry Knox, who had been in charge of executing the river crossing and then marching the advancing troops, reported on the complete shock of the Hessians at the moment of attack. The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy was not unlike that which will be when the last trump will sound. That's reference to 1 Corinthians 15:52. He openly acknowledged that Providence seemed to have smiled upon every part of this enterprise. This victory raised American spirits and encouraged men to enlist or re-enlist in the Army. God was yet again helping secure American liberty, and once more unexpected and dramatic weather had been instrumental.